Hi, Genevieve. Do you say Genevieve or Genevieve?
Genevieve. I'm not French.
Okay, perfecto. Coming from Canada, gotta check.
Oh,
Genevieve, thank you so much for joining me on the same drugs. I'm really excited to have you on. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
yeah, likewise. I've been following your work for, isn't it 10 years now? Feminist Current is coming up on 10 yeyears, isn't it?
Yeah,
So,
we
yeah.
made it to 10 years in the summer. Um, so that's a long time. And yeah, and obviously you've contributed so much to Feminist Current, and I'm following what you're doing at Reduxx, which is very impressive. I have no idea how you and Anna managed to pump out so much content, but you're doing a great job of like covering what's going on, and I don't think really anyone else is doing that, to be honest.
Yeah, I just want to say really quickly that, Anna works really hard. She's kind of the backbone of the team. And then now we have some more team members who are contributing, whereas initially it was sort of more or less, it was the two of us. But now we have kind of grown the team. And so I'm really proud to be working with all of these women.
Yeah, it's super impressive. You guys are contributing so much to the conversation around trans activism, gender identity ideology, and you all dig so deep. So it's super useful. Um, I mean, I I think that one of the most under discussed aspects of trans activism, of gender identity ideology for a very, very long time has been the the sexual fetish factor. And as far as I can tell, it's really only been radical feminists that have been talking about it for a long time. I think more people are sort of starting to talk about it a bit now. And then, of course, some sexologists like Ray Blanchard, who, of course, I believe he coined the term autogynephilia. And he did that much contested by the trans community study, which found that, you know, when he did this research, in any case, he found that there was a divide between younger men who tended to be gay men, and older, middle aged or so men who tended to have a sexual fetish, which he called autogynephilia. Um, I wonder if you can talk about what autogynephilia is. What is this sexual? People get offended when you say that. When you say, these men have fetishes, or like, this isn't about gender dysphoria or some kind of gender identity. This is a sex thing. But can you talk about what that is, what that means?
Right. So autogynephilia literally translates to love of the self as a woman, or philia means love, but it's used in when we discuss paraphilias, which technically means love for. I mean, I have problems with that term personally, but yeah, it describes sexual fetishes basically, which are overwhelmingly, and I mean 99% overwhelmingly found in men and not in women. And there's been some speculation that that might have to do with the physiological response. By that, I mean the erection, which women, have such a different anatomy that they just tend to be less prone towards erotic symbolism in that way, in the same way. It's just different. So, autogynephilia that you mentioned, Blanchard divided them into two groups: the uh, homosexual autogynephile and the heterosexual autogynephile. And I think he found that more or less the heterosexual men kind of dominated that category, that there were far more of them. That could just be simply because there are more heterosexual men, but whatever the reason, that's the case. So it tends to involve things like cross dressing, for example, something that we used to know of as transvestic fetishism, which is the cross dressing fetish. Basically, it's the technical term for it. Um, and yeah, on that note, I do just want to point out the lobbying that has been going on with removing that term from classification, diagnoses, and diagnostic manuals, like even just the term transvestic fetishism has been lobbied by so there was a Norwegian group that worked really hard to get that removed from the ICD put out by the World Health Organization, so that within the trans activism, you can, if you look hard enough, you can see the work behind the scenes where they're working really hard to normalize fetishes, actually. And so it's hard for me to separate the two, because on the one hand, they're telling the public that this has nothing to do with sex, that this is completely separate from sex, whilst trying to construct false penises or even selling prosthetic penises to children, but this has nothing to do with sex, we're told. And then they're also lobbying to have paraphilias removed from diagnostic manuals. So there's the public face of trans activism, and then there's what they are actually working to achieve in the background that is completely counter to the public image that they're trying to present. And autogynephilia, of course, being the elephant in the room on that front, because they'll say, no, it's not real. I think it was Julia Serrano. I don't know if you're familiar with Julia Serrano, but
A little bit.
he yeah, he has famously written a kind of article trying to debunk autogynephilia. Then you look at what Julia Serrano has written, and in a book called Whipping Girl, he has a chapter on how he has these fantasies about being sex trafficked as a woman, that he has rape fantasies about being made to be dressed up as a woman and then sexually abused. So, you know, on the one hand, he's kind of a perfect example for that himself, saying autogynephilia isn't real, it's not a thing, and then writing about his own fantasies that involve such things.
I wonder, do you know how common this fetish is?
Well, it's not totally clear. At one point, there was an estimation, and I think it might have been Anne Lawrence, maybe Anne Lawrence. I'm not sure exactly. Could have been Blanchard, but there was an estimation that it was about 1% of the population. Um, but you know, I some of that stuff is outdated now, I think, in my opinion, because of streaming pornography. And I think that, you know, Blanchard's work is excellent, you know, for what he did, but I think that the cohort is changing. I think that whatever research we have from the past is useful and helpful, but I think that something else is happening now where pornography is creating a kind of fetishism on a level that we hadn't seen before. I mean, because if you consider in the first place that just the act of watching pornography, you're already engaging in a paraphilia by that. You're engaging in voyeurism because you're not actually having sex with anyone. You're almost kind of having sex with yourself in a way, because you're looking at an image of other people, sure, but you're the only person in the room. So I think that it's kind of training a sort of a narcissistic sexual function, or to where perhaps the man is masturbating to himself in a way, or to what he wants. And then, of course, as we know, the use of pornography, it just escalates and escalates, which follows the similar pattern of fetishism. And so when you're looking at objects on a screen, you're looking at things that aren't really there. You're not having a full sensory experience. You're not with anyone. Your arousal attraction becomes then to objects. And then, of course, pornography objectifies women, breaks women down into pieces and parts, to breasts, surgically enhanced breasts, so buttocks, whatever, all of these parts and pieces. So I think that when we talk about autogynephilia, we should also keep in mind that things are changing very rapidly now. Children are being exposed to pornography at much, much younger ages. I've heard of, you know, 8-year-olds, and it's just all over social media. I mean, it's everywhere. And so I think that it's causing this problem to escalate. So when we say 1%, that's a bit outdated. And I kind of wonder if it's not just increasing because of pornography.
And what kinds of pornography are we talking about? I mean, I'm interested. I've read and spoken with women, as I know you have too, who identify themselves as trans widows. And these are women who were married to a heterosexual man, of course, who at some point in their relationship decided that he was going to transition to become a so called woman. And often part of their stories involves a fetish and pornography.
Mhm.
Is there something specific that's leading these men in this direction? Is it a specific kind of pornography? What have you found is going on there?
Yeah, that's really true. It's you get some of the most clear descriptions of this escalation from trans widows who have experienced it firsthand when they describe how it starts from a pornography addiction and then moves further and further, which is why actually I do have a little bit of trouble with terminology like the difference between a cross-dresser or a transsexual or all of these various stages because I sort of see it on a continuum, this step first and then following to the next. But these women go through hell, basically. I mean, um, they're in some cases the men will even try to appropriate their wives' or partners' identity. I've seen photos of this. Really, where the man has dressed up like his wife, but they often steal their clothing, start dressing up in their wives' clothing, and it really just does speak to the pornography addiction and the impact that it can have on restructuring of the brain. But I did also want to point out too that the first time the word transgender was put into print, and I think it was the year 1965 by a man named Dr. John Olivan, a psychiatrist and sexologist. He used that term. He's kind of credited actually with coining the term transgender, and he did so to make a distinction from the sexual component. So he was deliberately and said basically that he was trying to erase that sexual component involved. But he also would go on to urge psychiatrists to try to ensure that wives stayed with these husbands, actually, because he warned that if women divorced these men, they would kind of sink into depression and then possibly start acting out their fetish in public. So these women have, for a long time, served as a kind of buffer from public society in a terrible way. I know it's terrible to say that, but they've been taking the abuse from these men so that they could act out their fetish on their wives and then be validated by them. And then now we see that that is coming out in public, just sort of what Olivan kind of prophetically said, even if he didn't mean to. Um, but yeah, they get a lot of abuse for talking about it. Of course, that they're transphobic, that it's remarkable the things that they have to put up with, and so I just have a lot of sympathy for that.
Yeah. I mean, I thought what you said earlier about, I mean, because there is, of course, tranny porn, that men watch. I don't hear about women watching that kind of pornography. I mean, who knows? There might be a few here and there, but in general, of course, the audience for pornography is largely men. And I think that the kinds of men or the kinds of people who are watching trans porn are also men. So I don't know if that's like a key factor in men's desire to trans, but I thought what you said earlier around objectification was really interesting and makes a lot of sense, because if you think about how these men are relating to women and the idea that they are women or that they want to be women, it's literally about objectification. Like, they believe that if they attach these body parts, if they attach fake breasts to their body, that makes them a woman. If they have a surgeon create a hole in their body for a penis to go into, I'm not going to call it a vagina because it's not a vagina in any way, that makes them a woman. Um, and a key thing for these guys is to be viewed as women, you know, to go out in public and for somebody to mistake them for a woman and most likely a man, and that mistaking them for being a woman, I think would be around hitting on those men, you know, trying to have sex with those men, you know, seeing them as like a sexy woman that they want to have sex with.
Yeah, absolutely. They're turning themselves into the pornography, which is why I find it so disturbing. You know, they watch the pornography, become addicted to the pornography, and then want to embody, like literally embody the pornography. I feel, and I think I've said this before, that prostitution is the industry that sells sex as a verb. The gender identity industry sells sex as a noun. And then in between, you have pornography that's doing the transformation from verb to noun. So they feed into each other, and that's why you'll often see that trans activists lobby positively for the sex industry. They don't want prostitution to be criminalized or punished. They want that out in the open. They want it to be normalized. And then you will also see that these men will engage in turning themselves into pornography literally in order to raise funds for their plastic surgeries. There is something called a kind of a trans to OnlyFans pipeline, where it's like, you know, there's this emerging market, this whatever you want to call it, this technology new market online, where you can sell pornography without ever having to really engage with people, so the kind of the danger isn't there as it might have been in the past, right? um, and so these men are kind of seeing women being objectified through whatever, Instagram, OnlyFans, et cetera, everything, and then thinking, oh, well, I can make money off of that too. I can compete with these women and I can make money off that too. Now, whether they think that consciously, I don't know, but I mean, it seems to be the case that they are saying, okay, well, I don't want to have a job, I don't want to work, what's an easy way for me to get money? I'll, you know, get some plastic surgery and then put things in my butt, basically. Yeah, I think that's really a driving factor to the economics of it, that they can earn a lot of money by feminizing themselves. And then one of the big draws, or the way that transgender pornography will advertise itself, is by saying that, you know, they have the sex drive of a man but the body of a woman. So they'll be doing things that women might object to doing. And then often within transgender pornography, they might be paid double what a woman will be paid. So as you're seeing, women are getting asked to do increasingly degrading, torturous, barbarous things in pornography and getting paid less because the demand is so high. There's a new demand that's been created, which is the man pretending to be the woman. And then he'll do some of those things that maybe she wouldn't want to do, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the competition aspect is super strange and interesting. You'll hear trans activists say things like, you know, you're just mad because your boyfriend wants to, I'm trying not to swear, have sex with me. Um, and or like, you know, nobody wants you, everybody wants me, like you're just jealous because you're ugly and I'm hot. What do you think that's about?
It's men are kind of competitive, aren't they? I mean, generally, I'm not trying to say anything terrible about men, but I mean, it's pretty observable that, you know, men like sports, men like to compete with each other. Women, again, generalizing, tend to focus on cooperation. So, I mean, that's a very, very male pattern trait. You know, I'm a better woman than you could ever be.
Yeah.
That's what they tell us, basically. And how do they view womanhood? It's the things you can buy. Like we said, buying fake breasts, because, you know, the female body has been commodified and objectified in every conceivable way. I mean, alongside this too, we have to remember there's the rise of surrogacy. There are people talking about creating a breast milk industry, so that, you know, if you buy a baby, then you could also buy the milk from a woman as well. So women's bodies are being commodified, objectified, sold in every conceivable fashion, just about. And so now you have these men coming in and saying, "Well, I can buy my way into womanhood. I can just buy hormones, right? Female hormones. I can buy breasts. That'll make me a woman. And then on top of that, they'll have the gall to say, in some cases, that makes them a better woman than we are. We poor women who are just born being women and didn't have to work for it, apparently. So they think that this makes them better than us. And I'm saying this in a general capacity, but we both see those comments on social media. So
Yeah. I mean, I think I know that you saw this recent performance by a so-called trans comedian in the UK. His name was Jordan Gray, I think,
Gray.
and he went on live TV on a UK show called Friday Night Live and sang this song. I'm just going to read some of the lyrics.
It's quite literally called I'm Better Than You.
Yeah, it's quite literally called Better Than You. And it says, some of the lyrics are, I'm a perfect woman. I'm a perfect woman. My tits will never shrink. I'm guaranteed to squirt. I do anal by default. I am the lizard king. I can do anything that any other woman can't. I used to be a man. Now I'm better than you. Like,
Yeah.
it's unbelievable. It's like, they're saying the quiet part out loud and still everyone applauds. The
Right.
amount of like the media, the vast majority of the media, aside from probably right-wing media and some alternative media, celebrated this and thought it was like brilliant and hilarious and brave. Oh, and I forgot to mention, of course, he takes his penis out at the end of the song and dances around with his penis out and plays the piano with his penis. And this is amazing. And those are the lyrics. I mean, like what it's like he's shoving it in our faces.
But can't you just take a joke? I mean, why are you so uptight? I mean, it's just a joke. Chill.
And I mean, the guy's not even funny. Like, it wasn't even a funny song. But anyway, I mean, that sort of, that perfectly describes what you're talking about. And then this porn component. I can do all these things and I will do all these things that women won't do. And it's like, of course you'll do anal because you're a man, and anal isn't enjoyable for women. It's painful for women. And for men, it is or can be enjoyable because they have different body parts than we do. I wanted to talk about, with regard to the porn aspect, you wrote about something called sissy porn for Feminist Current a couple years ago or a few years ago. Can you talk about what sissy porn is and how that connects to transgenderism, to the trans trend?
Yeah, so sissy porn isn't just one thing, to be honest. It's short for sissification pornography, or sometimes a similar genre is called forced feminization. I think the forced feminization genre tends to be more hardcore and more focused on BDSM. Sissification almost tends to involve age regression, the concept of being a little girl, even. But basically, these things are, there are captions, they're called, which are images that involve usually a real woman, and then there's some kind of pornographic story written alongside them. These things can be found also on YouTube. People are making YouTube videos of this. I have personally seen videos of sissy captions that involved children with actual photos of real children, and then having these stories where an AI child's voice is reading them. It's highly disturbing. And there's also so the sissification, audio files. So audio files that include kind of like hypnosis. So it'll be called like sissy hypno, where it's just one person narrating and speaking, and they go on for hours and hours. I mean, really just the dedication that fetishism incorporates, because men who are driven by this sexual component tend to be very obsessed with it. So 4-hour long audio files of how you're a stupid bimbo, you're turning into a bimbo slut, your breasts are growing, you're becoming dumber, all of this kind of really retrograde crap. But, if you look in the comment sections of some of these things, you can see men who clearly are identifying as women, talking about how wonderful it is and how it helped them on their journey to discovering their real self. There are Patreon accounts, one that's called Bambi's Sleep, that I think earns something upwards of $3,000 a month. So again, there's money involved in this. There's a financial motive. And I've seen personal testimonies of men who had said that this kind of pornography in particular is extremely addictive for them because it incorporates your lifestyle. So there are things called sissy tasks that you're meant to do, which is taking your fetish out into the public. Can I be gross here? For example, wearing a butt plug all day while you wear women's underwear and go out to the supermarket, and it's like, ha ha ha, no one knows that you did this. It's very funny. And then kind of escalating it. Why don't you go into a women's bathroom and masturbate? Why don't you film it? Things like this. So it pushes people to kind of actually sublimate it into their identity, incorporate it into their identity, which is a little bit different from how we would have thought of pornography in the past, as something very passive that you view, I guess, as a viewer. But this asks you to change your actual behavior and actually to change your whole identity in some ways.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the exhibitionism factor is something that also is not talked about enough, I think, because it and I like that you said that you didn't want to differentiate between cross-dressing, transgenderism, and I'm not. Did you say drag also? Are you combining or transvestitism or something?
Yeah, all of it. It's all just sort of a spectrum of a kind of escalation, I think. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to bring up a perfect example of that, actually, which is the creator of the trans flag. So his name, Robert Hogue, he goes by Monica Helms. Helms is, you might find this amusing. He got that name from Lord of the Rings, Helms. But anyway, so he started off by going to drag clubs in 1978 in San Diego. So he's a Navy veteran, and he was stationed in San Diego and started having trysts with drag queens, basically. And then that's how he sort of started escalating his cross-dressing fetish. So he would steal women's underwear to masturbate into. He writes explicitly about this in his memoirs. So again, these men just cannot help but tell on themselves all the time. I read his memoir. He describes going to a laundromat to steal women's underwear. The technical term, I guess, for this is snowdropping, when a guy steals a woman's underwear to masturbate. So he was a
Okay.
snowdropper. He tried to force his wife to accommodate his fetish. He increasingly started spending a lot of family finances on dressing up, and he went to these events hosted by an organization called the Tri-S Society, which means the three S's, the Society for the Second Self. This was a very, very influential cross-dressing lobbying group in the United States that started around the 70s. And they still kind of exist today, but to a lesser degree. And they would imagine themselves to be like college girls. They use the word girls a lot in their publications. And he was involved in that organization. Transvestic fetishists. Their main goal, which by the way was to kind of indoctrinate the wives again into accepting this, trying to get women on board with this, because they think they recognized that if they could get women to accept this, then it could be normalized into society. So the creator of the trans flag was involved in this organization, and then he started attending orgies and sex clubs after he left his family. And then he created the trans pride flag in 1999. And when you ask people, do you know who made the trans flag? Not a clue. Most people don't have a clue, and it flies on government buildings. I've seen it flying at a preschool. It has been placed at the highest peak in Antarctica, for God's sakes, and people have no idea who made it. And I just wanted to bring that up because just look at this. He's a perfect example of the trajectory from drag to then identifying as a lesbian. Um, and then he wrote these erotic fiction stories, one of which involved a child. It's a story about him marrying a witch who looks like a little girl and doesn't age. So
It's so crazy. I mean, I didn't know. I didn't know that. I didn't know who created the trans flag. And I mean, I think that it's just it's become harder and harder and harder to deny not just the connection to fetish, but the connection to pedophilia, the connection to kids, girls. You know, a lot of people ask, and of course I've asked this as well, and I think I've come up with some kind of answer from talking to other women who've been looking into these issues and these men and the background of how trans activism became so mainstreamed and normalized. But of course, of this guy, Dylan Mulvaney, who's all of a sudden blown up thanks to his TikTok page. And I don't know what else was behind his very, very sudden fame. But in his TikTok videos, he refers to himself as a girl. He doesn't even refer to himself as a woman. He's not saying that he's a woman. He's calling himself a girl. And I mean, there's so much other sexism going on with this guy and how he describes himself and his experience becoming a so-called girl, his path to girlhood. How closely have you followed this guy?
I try to avoid watching his videos. They keep showing up in my feed, and then I want to throw my phone because it's like I've already seen this a million times, and it's so disturbing. I do kind of want to comment on the girl terminology though, because that's really prevalent. And I think that people tend to be kind of surprised by it. I mean, because, Dylan is so in your face now. I mean, he was at the White House, so maybe it's kind of the first time that some people are seeing this, infantilization, I guess. But it's very old actually. You can see it in some of the publications again that the cross-dressing organizations were putting out throughout the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. And there's a it's a little bit complicated to explain, but there seems to be a belief that among some of these men that taking female hormones will make them look younger. So they talk about things like getting girl skin by taking estrogen. There are men now who are microdosing estrogen because they want to prevent hair loss. They see women's hormones as a kind of a fountain of youth, and that's something that was put in these publications that I mentioned as well. There would be poems in there that these men had written about turning into a little girl. I shit you not. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to cuss. But yeah, so that they would write these things about being a little girl, coming into femininity. There's also among the rhetoric of trans activists the whole second puberty, they call it, that if you start female hormones, then you go into a second puberty, like growing
What do
breasts
you
and
mean by
so on.
that? Oh, okay, I see. They start
Yeah,
growing like, I mean,
not breasts, but you know what I mean. Yeah.
mhm.
Um, so they see that as, um, yeah. So within all of this too, what really stands out to me is kind of this killing of the self, the killing of the identity, and then replacing it with whatever artificial identity you want to put in there. And so the girl aspect, just to me, just smacks of autopedophilia. where men just kind of dress up or try to pretend to be the thing that they're erotically attracted to. So when a man describes himself as a girl, obviously huge red flag.
Yeah, and I mean, when you say the killing of the self, I think that the term dead naming is really significant there, which, this huge, huge, huge push to make so-called dead naming, practically a crime, certainly hate speech, to refer to a person who now identifies as trans and has come up with a new name to correspond with their desired sex. For anyone to mention their previous name, even in reporting, like even in journalism when they were reporting on crimes, past crimes, often violent crimes, often sexual crimes, you know, journalists won't do it. The media won't do it. You're not allowed to do it on social media or you'll get banned. Um, what do you think about that? What do you think is behind this term dead naming and this idea that's been forced upon us to consider, to think about dead naming as this horrifically cruel, hateful, dangerous, almost violent thing to do to a person?
Well, again, within the euphemisms, they sort of tell on themselves, don't they? I mean, dead naming, that's your birth name. So you're quite literally changing, and I'm sorry to keep using that word, but you're changing, the birth name to a death name. Um, so it's the complete opposite. There's so much in this language where it's you take one thing and you just turn it into the complete opposite of reality. It's maddening. It's there's a word for that. What is that? It's not Darvo, but anyway, it's kind of a patriarchal reversal, I think, is something that Mary Daly kind of called this phenomenon of taking one thing that's true and then flipping it on its head. But yeah, you can see that there's a kind of a killing of the identity of the self, a desire for rebirth, which is why it sort of resembles cult aspects in that capacity. But I've mentioned this before, and so maybe people are tired of hearing me talk about this book, but I just found this chapter in this book to be so enlightening. A book called Masochism and the Self by Professor Baumeister, who's a social psychologist. And this was published in the 80s. I want to say 89, so it's a bit older. You probably couldn't get away with publishing this today. But he has a chapter in there called Femininity, Masculinity, and Masochism. And he kind of details his work with talking with transvestic fetishists and in terms of BDSM and masochism. um, I want to come back to the BDSM thing, don't let me forget.
Okay.
But so he describes masochism as a flight from self, that it's a desire to sink totally into the body and to remove consciousness, self-consciousness. And so instead of actually removing the self, what tends to happen is that a false self is constructed. And he described this with the men who would dress up in women's clothing for erotic pleasure, for example. So he said that male masochism in particular, it does not resemble female masochism, even though they take on the trappings of a female identity or a femininity. Male masochism tends to be more competitive, as in taking pride in how much pain they can sustain. It also involves exhibitionism. Male masochists are incredibly exhibitionist. They need to have an audience in order to see what they're doing, in order to get validated or thrilled by it. Without that audience, it doesn't seem to serve much function for them. Um, and so you can see these obvious parallels between how masochism and selfhood is being played out with the transgender identity, creating a new self and then kind of expecting the public to cheer you on, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, the narcissism factor is impossible to ignore.
Mm.
Um, Even if people are not willing to talk about the narcissism and the exhibitionism in terms of the fetish aspect of transgenderism, I think we can not ignore the public behavior of these men and how much of that is about narcissism and wanting to center themselves in every single conversation, and of course, particularly conversations about women, and how much they want to present themselves in a look at me way. Here I am in a skirt with my penis poking out. No one's allowed to say anything. Everyone has to celebrate me and tell me how amazing and brave and brilliant I am.
Yeah, they have to be seen in order to get whatever it is they're getting out of it, whether that's sexually motivated or financially motivated. So, yeah, the narcissism factor, there is an overlap too between narcissism and masochism, which most people tend to find confounding because they don't understand how masochism is linked to that. Because I think most people tend to think of masochism in terms of maybe they're depressed or maybe they're miserable and so they want to self-harm or something. But actually, there is a big overlap between narcissism and masochism because they both involve the construction of another identity. Narcissists create the narcissistic projection of what they want to be, and then they use it as a form of protection. Maybe they feel insecure about themselves, and so they create this barrier, which is the fake self. And then masochists just kind of do a really similar thing with creating a fake self in order to hide from the world the real self. So it's a kind of a smoke and mirrors sort of thing that both of them do. I actually have wondered, maybe people in the comments can point me to something, but how narcissism might be a social contagion, actually. I think about the fetishism as a social contagion spread through pornography, but maybe there's something to that about narcissism and social media as a contagion too.
I mean, I certainly think that social media fuels narcissism and encourages narcissism in all sorts of ways, in obvious ways, like the post selfies of yourself online and have everyone like your photo and tell you how hot and sexy or beautiful you look. And you get a certain, boost from that, a temporary boost, like
Can I
taking a
just
drug.
Yeah, can I just say on that note, you've just reminded me of something, which is this phenomenon of men using face filters to look like women. And then I just strongly, strongly suspect they're masturbating to it. Or or like filming themselves with a female looking filter on and then kind of like making their own porn. I really feel like that is something that is happening, although with a lot of this stuff, you can't point to any research, but it must be
But
happening.
clearly, eventually, one of them will admit to it or brag about it.
Yeah.
Watching the patterns here. Yeah,
Right.
of course, you're right. I mean, if you're dealing with a trans identified male online, and you're dealing with his avatar that might look feminine, and then you actually go look up who this guy is online, especially if you're able to find his old name, but even not, if you find, his Instagram or his Facebook and you're able to delve a little deeper into the photos that he didn't filter, he doesn't look anything like that. He still looks very mannish and usually quite repulsive looking. Um, you mentioned that you wanted to talk about the BDSM factor a little more. I am interested to know what you have to say about that connection.
Well, I'll just start off by saying I talked to a woman last year who was a former dominatrix, and she kind of confirmed some of my suspicions about this trajectory from sadomasochism into sissy into trans, because she said that personally she saw this happening actually. And it's again got to do with the masochism factor, and selfhood, the relationship between identity and masochism. So when we think about BDSM, like, okay, so I know there are people who defend BDSM or say that, it can be done in consensual, safe ways. I'm well aware of that. I am speaking of the psychological factor. And I'm also speaking of things that are not just simply like, I don't know, handcuffs or something cute. I'm talking about, actual sadomasochism, cutting, torture, things that go beyond, just playing around a little bit. Um, And so when you have a situation like that, your brain kind of goes into fight or flight mode as the recipient, that is, as the masochist or the person who is being, they call it the sub within this language, right? The submissive. And they talk about something that's called subspace, which is submissive space. They describe this as, the kind of euphoric thrill that you get when you're in extreme pain, or when you're being degraded, dehumanized, essentially. But subspace is really just a euphemism for dissociation. And so within BDSM practices, what you're doing is you're kind of sexualizing and naturalizing dissociation, mind-body separation. That is the entire point. That's not a knock-on effect. That's the goal. So you're splitting from yourself, you're actively fleeing from yourself, and then later on, in something of a sort of abusive pattern of relationships, the dom, or usually the man, will do what's called aftercare. So it's got this, it really follows this pattern of what happens within abusive relationships, but when you slap the word consent on it, suddenly it's not abuse anymore. That's a whole thing to itself. But so, yeah, so I see that as being really parallel to the trans movement, but I mean, it's not just my own personal feeling. I mean, it's quite visible in some of the stories that I've published, the overlap between BDSM and transgenderism. And I'll, as a point of fact, there was an early version of the trans flag that was being considered, and it had the BDSM flag on it. So it was a combination of the pink and blue, and then the BDSM flag, and then the pride flag all together. And again, like I mentioned, within the lobbying, the transgender lobbying, the push to normalize sadomasochism, and then you'll see the overlap between kink, they call it now. You see this euphemistic language as well. That, I'm sorry, I'm jumping all over the place, but the euphemistic language within BDSM is really striking to me within the trans movement's language, right? So even think about things like top and bottom, right? So in BDSM, the dom, or the dominant, is the top, and then the submissive is the bottom, or the sub. Well, then we have top surgery and bottom surgery, don't we? And I know that that might seem unrelated, but uh, again, it's this infantilizing language that obscures what is actually happening. Even prior to the 90s, the term sadomasochism, it was just called sadomasochism, or SM. And it was in a Usenet forum where the term BDSM was coined. So it was within a pornographic Usenet forum that BDSM was coined deliberately to obscure kind of the negative associations with sadomasochism. So again, the overlap between these two things, you'll often find that people who claim a transgender status, specifically men who claim a transgender status, tend to be involved in BDSM, as you probably are aware with the Haley Heartless character out of Canada. There's also, you guys have Nina Arsenault in Canada. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but that's his whole life's work, basically, to normalize sadomasochism. And he talks about getting off during surgeries. And so the component between sadomasochism and transgenderism is quite strong. I have seen genital surgeries uploaded as pornography within forums. So again, within pornography consumption, there's a tendency to escalate to more and more extreme things in order to elicit a thrill. And that can manifest in self-harm, obviously within BDSM. But then I've noticed too that in some cases it tends to move towards actual genital mutilation. Fortunately, this doesn't seem to be quite mainstream yet, I think. But it is something that I have noticed. For example, when I was looking in the Eunuch archive that WPATH linked to, for those who don't know, WPATH being the leading transgender health body in the world, linked to a fetish forum in their standards of care document that was called the Eunuch archive. And within that forum, they were posting quote unquote MTF surgeries as pornographic material. This actually falls in line with another kind of sadomasochistic pornography that's shortened to CBT, which is cock and ball torture, which involves exactly what it sounds like. Um, so, and I just want to point out too, Alfred Kinsey. Alfred Kinsey kind of famously was sort of addicted to pornography, a chronic masturbator, and he himself tried to mutilate his own genitals at one point with a knife. So, for whatever reason, this escalation and desensitization, because that's what it is, desensitized to extreme content, can play out in much similar ways to what we see with these surgeries in transgenderism.
Yeah, I mean, what I noticed about so many of these guys, you mentioned a couple of the Canadian ones, Haley Heartless, for example. There's almost always a connection either to prostitution, to the BDSM community, very often to pornography. I don't know if you followed the Kiwi Farms story. It's super complex and there's a lot going on there, but the 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 guys who were sort of behind the push to get rid of Kiwi Farms these were young men who were identifying as trans, some of whom had trans surgeries and had been for a very long time, posting pornography of themselves online and were really involved in these online fetish communities, pretty clearly to me from the time that they were minors. And yeah, I don't have too much to add beyond that, except that they all do seem in some way connected to these fetish communities, BDSM. And, I was trying to parse that connection between around that reality that trans activists were also always advocates for the sex industry. The people who were fighting to legalize the sex industry were the exact same people fighting to say that trans women are women. And I couldn't really ever figure out exactly why that was. Also, always the same people fighting to normalize pornography and BDSM.
Always. They know the connection. That's why they're so organized on this front. Internationally, all transgender lobbying lobbies for the sex industry. So it just can't be a coincidence, you know? And I'm going to say something, maybe it's a little controversial, but when men enter the sex industry, they are not as impacted by it as women are. Often women have to do it because they're forced financially, because they have been sexually abused. And it's just harder for women on their bodies, on their lives, everything, right? And so when men advocate for the sex industry, they are advocating for women's oppression. They are advocating for torturing women, actually.
And girls.
So, and girls, of course, yes. And so I feel often that now, of course, this is not everybody, but often these men get involved with the sex industry in order to pay for their fetishistic surgeries, to turn themselves into women, to fulfill their own fetishes, to fulfill their own sexual satisfaction, or to sate their appetite for sexual desires, whatever. It's not driven, by and large, doesn't seem to be driven by, I have children to feed or something like this. It seems to be very self-serving. And also, within some of these things called sissy captions that I mentioned earlier, the repeated themes of wanting to be sex trafficked or wanting to be raped, like even Julia Serrano, who is a prominent trans activist, wrote about wanting to be forcibly sex trafficked and raped, and that he was thrilled by the thought of his male privilege being erased in this way. So that's clearly, again, the masochistic fantasy. So in some senses, I almost see the lobbying for the continued sexual trafficking of women as related to their fantasy. Well, if their fantasy is to be subordinated or treated like a woman, whatever the fuck that is supposed to mean, usually being treated like a woman means being, made less than, being objectified. How can they
Being
fulfill that?
helpless, being a victim, being abused, yeah, being
Right.
objectified.
So if we eliminate the sex industry, if we stop the sex trafficking of women and girls, how are they going to get off if they don't have that? So it's
Mm.
it's the opposite of fighting for equality. It is fighting for literally. I keep saying that word and then I become self-aware that I've said it. But it is fighting for the actual continued sexual slavery of women because, well, whatever reason they get off on it, I don't know.
It's really, really appalling on a number of levels how trans activism has been framed as part of the feminist movement as a fight for rights, and how gender identity ideology has overtaken much of the feminist movement, with the exception of radical feminism, because the misogyny is so overt, in ways that you've described, but also in terms of the activism. I think you observed and you covered what happened in New York recently at Kelly J. Keene's Let Women Speak event. I've watched several of the videos, and these men who showed up to protest her were so full of rage, and it was manifested in the strangest way. Probably not strange to you, but strange to look at and observe. um I mean, you covered it. Can you talk a little bit about what you saw and what happened?
Yeah, so for those who didn't see the video, I would maybe encourage you to do so when you have some time. But it is a little bit kind of sensitive, so maybe don't do it around other people. But yeah, these men. Where do I begin? I mean, so that they gathered in New York, right? And there was about 30 of these women who had gathered to speak. And then they were swarmed by trans activists, some estimates between, I don't know, 100, 200, a large crowd that overwhelmed them. And so they were sort of trapped. And then the police set up these barricades between them. And, they were trying to keep the trans activists from breaching the barricades. But then the video that went viral was of this trans model, Amara Velasquez, who was topless and had his shirt off, and then was yelling at a woman that he was going to beat her up. He was again doing that thing where he was sort of suggesting that he was a better woman than she was, grabbing his non-existent breasts. But then I don't know if you saw, Megan, but a day after that, another video came out that was of a man standing next to this and grabbing his kind of like man boobs and squeezing them and playing with them for an extended period of time while the pair of them were shouting uh, derogatory things at women. It was disgusting, but it was also kind of striking to think that he's arousing himself. He's playing with himself and arousing himself while women are being shouted at and degraded. And I mean, for me, another striking thing to see was that the woman in between them. So there's a trans man who is a model who was standing between them, who had had a double mastectomy. Um, so on either side, there are these two men playing with their chests, and then a woman between them who's had her breasts removed. It's what do you say? I mean, I feel like the world's going crazy. But at least at least that video is out there now. I think a lot of people are seeing it. I know that Gina Hawk, who was being yelled at, went and talked with. I think she talked with Tucker Carlson recently. I might be wrong,
Mm-hmm,
but
mm-hmm,
but
yeah.
um, yeah. So I think a lot of people are seeing it, and it's really good. I mean, I admire these women so much. for going out into the street to confront this. Would they need our support? I mean, they're just doing such great work. In a way, they're almost setting themselves up like bait for this kind of aggressiveness so that the world can see it finally. So,
Yeah, I mean, it's so terrifying and scary. And I mean, what struck me the most was the combination of the sexualization, the sexual factor. I'm talking about these men, and the violent rage and the threats of these men saying, like, I'm going to beat the shit out of you. And as you said, that the model, this guy who's a trans model, talking about how nobody wants you, like, you look like shit, I'm the hottest, blah 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 blah. And very clearly getting off on this. And while they're identifying as women and insisting that they're women, and that not only that they're women, but they're better women than females, and at the same time they clearly hate women so deeply. It's
yeah.
really strange.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's that strange. I mean, objectification is about dehumanization, isn't it? So if you're going to reduce an entire group of people down to silicone implants or what have you, then you're dehumanizing them. That's an expression of hatred in itself. I mean, I even think just the male claim to a female identity is hatred. It's saying that you don't exist without me. You can't possibly exist except in my own fantasy.
And you are a fantasy. There's no difference between me, who is fantasizing about being a woman, and you, an actual female.
Mm-hmm.
Before I let you go, I want to talk about drag. Most people, including people in the drag community, including trans activists, including probably most liberals and progressives, separate drag from transgenderism. Those terms are defined differently. And, both of them, of course, are to be accepted by everyone who's open-minded. But there is a connection, as you've discussed, between drag and transgenderism. And I think that a lot of people didn't really pay much attention to drag or didn't care very much about drag. It was mostly limited to the gay community and kind of like hipsters who wanted to partake as well. But I don't think that the mainstream was particularly concerned, and I don't even know that the right was particularly concerned. The right has become super concerned, as well as a lot of parents, as well as some feminists, because of this very, very new trend called drag story time or story hour, which has all of a sudden infiltrated all of North America. Like, all of a sudden across Canada, it's really important that story time is performed by men dressed up in drag, and of course across the US too. And like, the first thing that baffles me, I was like, why? What was wrong with the librarians reading stories to the kids? And I was told by a friend that, it was really, I mean, it was like she was repeating something she read off the internet, of course. But essentially, we're told, if we question this in any way at all, I mean, my questioning was pretty like milquetoast. Like, it's like, why? Why does it have to be a man dressed up as a woman? Like, why can't, what was, the librarians are good at their job. They can do it. Like, why does this matter? And it's like, it's important to teach kids to be open-minded about different kinds of people. But where did this come from? What's happening here?
Um, where did it come from? I don't know if I can really tackle that, but I just want to point out for a second how insulting this is to women, because just within the story hour concept first, because a majority of teachers are women. This has historically been one of the very first professions that women could get, is to be a teacher, particularly of young children, because it was seen to be something that women were just
That
naturally
was how
inclined,
they could go
inclined
to
to do.
post-secondary school. Like, women weren't really allowed to go to post-secondary school except to go to teachers college.
Mm-hmm. So you have a large majority of women being the teachers who are doing the reading to children. uh, underpaid terribly and overworked awfully. So then you have this man swooping in uh, with pounds of makeup on his face, trying to pretend to be a woman or something, I guess. And then we need this. You're taking that time away that a teacher would have had with the children, essentially to validate this narcissistic man. Now, the question is not why do we need drag queens teaching children? It's why do drag queens need to be around children? Why are they using children as props for their own narcissistic validation? Right? I mean, that's the question here, isn't it? Um, we don't have, I don't know, think of any other minority group, or think of a group of people who are not doing story hour for children. I mean, this seems to be overwhelmingly just men performing this really sexualized, degrading stereotype of women. Um, so yeah, just in a broader context of drag, it's just incredibly insulting to women. We're not supposed to say so. And then of course, if you do, they'll bring up, oh, well, there's drag kings. Women don't get off at wearing pants. It's just not a thing. Women
Well,
have fought.
drag kings, like they actually try to look like regular men. They're not looking like cartoonish versions of men, cartoonish, pornish versions of men who are also strippers and doing
Well,
strip shows.
I think sometimes they do, but
But well, okay,
but I mean,
yeah.
it's generally it's not.
But it's not
It's
an
really not.
exaggerated image of a man. It's not, I don't, or whatever. Maybe I'm not an expert on drag kings, but the drag kings that I've seen have just been wearing like a suit and tie.
Right. Yeah, there's a huge difference. And again, I think maybe Janice Raymond had pointed this out. That women just don't dress up for sexual reasons like this in the same way that men do. And that's because femininity is eroticized. Femininity itself, if we want to get down to it, because that's what it comes to, is femininity is a kind of masochism when it's done to an extreme degree. It limits your movements.
It's
It is a
painful.
it's painful, incredibly painful. My grandmother, my God, my grandmother wore high heels all her life because that was just what people did at the time. She was born in 1919. And then by the time that she's in her 50s and 60s, she literally, I keep saying literally, I'm so sorry.
I do it too. Don't worry
She,
about it.
and it's always when I'm saying the worst thing. She couldn't walk. Okay. She couldn't walk anymore without high heels because her calf muscles had shortened from using them. So we're talking about, kind of the constructs and trappings of femininity being extremely painful for women, and then to have men come in and turn an entire career out of this, out of what is the objectification of women. They're turning into their own personal career, their hero's journey, their self-fulfillment, etc. So they're basically saying that their self-fulfillment comes from degrading women. That's the message that I get.
And it's all about narcissism. And I've thought something similar to what you said about that, which is that, like, why do you have to involve kids in your validation? Drag is all about look at me, look at me, look at me. And you know what? If you want to do that in like a gay nightclub and everybody there is loving it and into it and is having fun, then fine, go do that. But kids don't have a choice. Like, you're showing up at their classroom, or to this library where their parents have taken them. Those kids didn't drive themselves there, because you want to perform and you want to wear these women's outfits and perform your fantasy. Why kids? Why do the kids have to be there?
Right. And it's very sexual. To deny that is absurd. Anyone can see that it's sexual. So what you're doing is basically saying, okay, we need to get children to accept men's fetishes. No, we don't.
It is that is what they're saying. I mean, I just learned about this recently because I was writing an article. But the one of the guys who founded, well, he sits on the board of Drag Queen Story Hour, and he's like kind of a founder of this Drag Queen Story Hour movement. He's a genderqueer college professor named Harris Kornstein. And he goes by the drag name Little Miss Hot Mess. And he essentially wrote the manifesto for this movement, which is called Drag Pedagogy, the playful practice of queer imagination in early childhood. And the paper is really weird. If you haven't read it, you should look at it. I mean, it's all about breaking down boundaries.
Mm.
Like,
Mhm.
and normalizing things that make people feel uncomfortable, like getting rid of social norms around family, sexuality, gender, sex. But now they're talking about doing it with kids, like confusing kids about what sex is and confusing those boundaries and categories, and essentially getting kids to kind of, before, like, kids haven't had a chance to understand how to create boundaries and set boundaries. They haven't
Mhm.
learned that yet. And before they've even gotten to that point, you're wanting to teach them that they shouldn't feel viscerally uncomfortable with
Mhm.
things that probably should make them feel viscerally uncomfortable with, because they can't judge. You know what I mean?
Which again overlaps with some of the theorizing of pro pedophile academics. I wrote about a man named Gert Heckma who talked about this, talked about he would talk about the Marquis de Sade in his classrooms. And well, I guess that fits with him being a sexologist, doesn't it? But he also talked about this, how you need to introduce kind of sexuality in schools when children are young. And again, it is that boundaries, the barriers that you're talking about. And we're always told not to judge, be kind, don't judge,
Mm.
remove all critical thinking. And I just, before I forget, I also wanted to make a point about motivations. So going back to the idea of the spectrum of, drag until whatever, transgender or whatever, that whole spectrum, we're asked to differentiate these groups, right? We're asked to put them into different categories rather than considering them as part of some whole package, right? And then when we're asked to do that, we're asked to consider their motivations. So each kind of group of this has a different motivation for basically for parodying women, for taking over women's identity. Oh, well, this group has a different motivation from that group. Therefore, they're different. Well, you know who else asks you to consider motivations is pro pedophile lobbyists, that you could separate an action from someone's intention or motivation. You see that within virtuous pedophilia, the organization, where they say, you can have the desire, but the desire doesn't make you a predator or something like this. And so instead of focusing on the outcome or the result, we, the society at large, are meant to be sympathetic towards the motivation rather than what the result of something is, which is kind of a perfect setup for predators, because then you can get sympathy, then you get people to take on your point of view and your perspective and not think about what the result of that is. And for example, there's some research showing that children who are exposed to pornography at a very young age kind of escalate quickly, or more quickly than they would have, into consuming pornography that depicts child sexual abuse,
Right.
bestiality,
Yep,
things like
saw
that.
that.
So
Yeah. This is a big question, but how do you think it is that these men who are fetishists and perverts manage to gain so much power in the mainstream so quickly? So much power within institutions like academia, political power, within, charities, NGOs. I mean, really, all institutions across North America in any case.
A couple of things. First, it wasn't very quickly. We're just sort of starting to see it, I guess, in the last 10 years coming out into the mainstream, but it hasn't been quickly. It's been a decades long process. Uh, Second thing is that these men, like I mentioned, are extremely compulsive and driven. A man driven by a sexual fetish is perhaps one of the most determined sorts of people in the world. Think about pedophiles, for instance, that go to extreme lengths to get access to children. Now, I'm not saying, I'm not trying to tar everyone with the same brush. I mean, but just having that sexual motivation, it's quite powerful and it's quite strong. There's a tendency towards obsessive compulsiveness about it. And again, they've been lobbying for a long time. I mentioned the Trias Society. There were many of these. There were organizations in the UK as well as in New Zealand. And often some of the men involved in this tended to be powerful anyway. Just think about, sadomasochism, right? We get that word from two noblemen. So the Marquis de Sade, as well as the Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, who's an Austrian nobleman. These are the men who have power, and they spent their lifetime indulging fetishes, basically. So when we ask the question about how did this get into the mainstream, you have to also consider power. The fact that men who are in power might be more likely to fetishize powerlessness, like masochism, for example.
Because
So
it's
there
just a fantasy for them. It's not a reality. It's
It's
not a
not real,
threat.
right. If you're actually someone who has gone through, really difficult life, trauma, pain, the idea that you would want to just kind of relive that for fun, it doesn't seem to be something that happens nearly as often as men who have a lot of privilege and power. That's just an observation. But yeah, so I saw a documentary too about cross dressers where there was like a senator who was involved in these groups. So yeah, the element of power is very strong, as is the financial aspect. I know that there are people who are diving into that financial aspect much more deeply, so that's why I focus on the power element. But yeah, I mean, powerful combined with a kind of obsessive uh, desire. That is what has brought us here a lot. People put a lot of credit to queer theory, which I understand. And that's very easy to look at because you have published writings that very clearly detail what they want, But I actually feel that not enough attention has been paid to the pornography grooming aspect and to the lobbying that was going on around the time of the sexual revolution, around the 60s, 70s, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, and we saw that change happen very clearly within feminism. We got past the second wave, and then all of a sudden it was the third wave, and there was this enormous focus on, again, normalizing BDSM, normalizing sex work, normalizing pornography, and making female objectification into something empowering and liberating and feminist.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, then the trans thing infiltrated feminism very easily, apparently.
Right. Julia Serrano's book, Whipping Girl, The Scapegoating of Femininity. There was this strong push to say, well, you can be feminine and that's empowering. All of the things that women of the past had tried to deconstruct or analyze deeply, suddenly, no, don't think about that. It's just fun, embrace prostitution. It's good for you, things like that. Yeah. Again, I keep mentioning this, but that was also in these cross-dressing manuals. Like they called themselves femme files. So they were saying they were turned on by femininity, and that they would make fun of women who were not feminine. Even they made horrible jokes about their wives. So yeah, I feel that with this push, the transgender push, defining women by objectifying constructs is another way of redirecting women back into them.
Do you think that now that there is more pushback finally happening in the mainstream, and it's not just radical feminists screaming into the ether, do you think that this is coming to an end, or do you think this is all just only beginning?
I don't know. I don't know.
It's hard to make predictions. I mean, I hate to try to make predictions because I can't predict the future, but
I mean, there are things that have happened that I couldn't have predicted even paying attention to this. So I don't know. I think that a lot of the Pushback now is focusing on children, and that's great. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but I do worry that at the end of things, that not only will women be blamed for this, but they'll be forgotten in this,
They're
actually.
being blamed for it. I mean, look at now the, leader of the gender critical movement. I'm saying that sarcastically in case anyone doesn't pick up on that. Matt Walsh. He's blaming, and this guy, Chris Elston, this massive narcissist, who's behaving like an abusive, misogynist bully online, and also claims to be leading the fight to save kids from the trans movement. Both of these guys are blaming feminists and blaming women for the whole thing, for not just for the existence of trans activism and gender identity ideology and gender identity legislation, but for having failed in their fight, which, we've been doing almost completely alone for decades.
Yeah, exactly. It's astonishing. I see Chris Rufo, who has started using the term radical trans activists, and he did that sort of after he made a tweet that I don't remember the exact phrasing, but it was something like "turfs are useful, but they can be discarded when we're done," something like that. And so I almost feel that there's a planned strategy, whatever you call it, trying to connect feminists to this using the word radical trans activist, which, doesn't that sound like radical feminist? I mean, it seems like they're trying to pull a linguistic association here with feminism, and that is the most egregious form of victim blaming that I can even possibly imagine. Especially, again, to go back to the wives of these men. The wives of these men in the Trias Society that I mentioned, they had only just won the right to have a bank account in their name. Okay, that was 1974. So then they're being dragged along to these men's fetishistic gatherings where they can play pretty princess and try to learn how to walk in high heels, and they can't leave them, right? And they're being groomed into this. And yes, I know that there are feminists who have supported this. I'm very well aware of that. And that tends to be within academic feminism, which I make a distinction there. But in the reality of the workaday person in the real life, it has been fetishistic men forcing themselves onto the public, grooming women, bringing women and children into this in order to back them up, and then now to turn around and to blame feminism at large, feminism as a whole, for something that men are doing. It is disgusting, frankly. It's disgusting, and it does great damage to women who have had to put up with some of these abusive men.
It is disgusting. I mean, the most misogynistic movement I've seen in my lifetime that is destroying women's rights, that is, destroying women, it's erasing women. And it's silencing women, it's censoring women, it's endangering women, it's endangering the most vulnerable and the most marginalized women in the entire world. It's obviously degrading, it's obviously sexist. And to blame women and to blame feminists for that, and to say that we've just been screwing this up and whining on the sidelines while only the men can really address this movement and achieve anything. It's repulsive.
Well, yeah, and then they can go on to make careers and make money out of it
And
again.
they're profiting. Yeah.
Profiting, right. Again, it's like similar to the drag industry in a way, where you're taking something about women having to do with women and then turning it into your own kind of profit mill. And then, the man set them free. The women were having such a hard time, but by golly, this man came along, and that's wonderful. Without him,
Thank God. What would we do? We are so
mhm.
useless, and we're such helpless victims. It's been really great to talk to you, even though now I'm more mad than ever.
Well, good. Good. Be mad. Be
Totally.
angry.
Oh, I know. I think that it's actually really important that we remind ourselves why we're so angry about this on a regular basis, because it gets to be a lot, and it gets really like repetitive because it just keeps happening. Like every day in the news, there's something else horrible where like some kind of male predator was housed in a women's shelter or impregnated women in prison or is, winning the track meets, or is, punching women in public because they're daring to speak about their interests and their rights.
Where are the feminists? I don't know, but it's their fault. It's their fault though.
Where
I don't
are
know
the
where they are,
feminists?
but they did this.
Tell us where, or tell people who are listening where they can find your work and follow you online.
Okay. I always don't like this part of the so
I'll link to it all down below too, so don't worry too much, but I like
okay.
to give people the opportunity, obviously, to promote their work.
So yeah, so it's reduxx.info, Reduxx with 2x's.info is the website. With the news articles, we have a really great team. So we cover issues around the world. It's not just, specific to one country, and then focusing on safeguarding and women's rights as it relates to gender ideology. I have a Substack, which is, my name, GenevieveGluck.substack.com. And then I've also been doing some podcasting, just speaking with women, doing some interviews or talking about the news, called Women's Voices. So I think that covers everything.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for talking with me about all this today. I've learned a lot. I'm sure everyone watching and or listening has learned a ton also, and I hope that they're all as enraged as we are.